I am Inspector, and I solve mystery. Welcome to my new case.
It was a November rain that evening, the sort that hung in the air like unspoken doubt. From my seat in the snug of the Jericho Tavern, I could watch it thread down the leaded windows in diagonal strokes, each bead trembling before it joined the next and slipped into the guttering below. The lamps outside threw pale yellow cones onto the slick pavement, and the people who passed beneath them seemed hurried, diminished, as though Oxford itself had drawn in its breath and held it. I nursed a pint of bitter, its head already thinning, and listened to the low hum of a transistor radio that should not have been alive. It sat on the far end of the bar, an old set with a cracked plastic grill and a dial faded to an indistinct grey. From its speaker leaked the slow unfurling of Schubert. Not a full movement, just a fragment, the last sigh of a melody. The landlord, wiping glasses with a cloth stiff from years of use, muttered that the thing was unplugged, and even as he said it, he bent down to show me the cord coiled neatly on the floor. He seemed faintly embarrassed by his own statement, as if superstition had slipped into his voice without permission. I told him not to worry. Radios had a way of storing ghosts. Perhaps it was only some errant signal bleeding in from another device, or the echo of an old transmission held in the wiring of the place. Yet even as I spoke, I found myself holding my breath to catch the next bar of music, which faded and returned like a memory trying to reform. The landlord moved off and left me with my pint, the radio, and the smell of rain-soaked coats. I had been reading the crossword in that morning's paper, a routine that no longer provided much satisfaction. The clue I had stopped on was Station of Remorse. 4 letters. It had lodged in my mind like grit under a fingernail. I had penciled in gate before doubting myself. Now, as the music trembled through the snug, the clue seemed oddly prescient. Station of Remorse. Gate of what? I tapped the table lightly with my pen. 2 students came in, speaking in the clipped tones of people who believe they are overheard only by each other. One complained about a late essay, the other about a lecture given by a man whose name I half recognized. Their words washed over me like the rain, carrying with them the faint scent of wet wool and ambition. The radio hissed, dropped its signal, then resumed with a scrape of static. There was a small gesture, nothing more than a shift of the landlord's eyes towards the set. He looked not at it, but at the reflection of it in the bar mirror, as though the device's face in glass was truer than its body. In that moment, I recalled a girl from years before who had spoken to me of echoes. She had been a cellist, precise, with a way of holding her bow as if it contained the silence between notes. We had met once at a college recital, and I had arrived late. She had never forgiven me for that lateness, though she had said nothing. The pint went warm in my hand. I set it down and reached for the paper again, reading the clue aloud in my head. Station of Remorse. Perhaps not gate, after all. Perhaps limb. No, absurd. The radio released a final phrase of Schubert and then fell silent, as if the ghost within had slipped away. The snug felt emptier for it. Lewis would call me later, though I did not know it then. He would tell me of a dead man in a college room, of an unplugged radio that had played at full volume beside the body. But at that moment I had only the rain, the crossword, and the faint vibration of something about to begin. I remember thinking how often things announce themselves in miniature before they arrive, like the first bar of a symphony you think you know but cannot yet name. I closed my eyes, and in the hush that followed the radio's silence I could still hear the ghost of a cello and the sound of rain writing its own score down the glass. The morning had begun with the sound of rain again, a thinner drizzle than the night before, but persistent enough to etch faint veins down my kitchen window. I'd been at the table with the crossword, pencil hovering over a clue about a second life of a scholar. 6 letters, and for once my mind refused its usual alacrity. The kettle hissed behind me. The smell of overboiled tea mingled with damp paper. It was then the telephone rang. Lewis's voice, muted but urgent, as if he already knew he was intruding on something private. A retired Don at St. Cuthbert's had been found lifeless in his rooms. The porter had called it a heart attack. Lewis did not believe in coincidences, but he sounded as though he hoped I would. By the time I reached the college, the rain had thinned to a mist that clung to my coat. St. Cuthbert's always struck me as a place where time held its breath. Stone cloisters greened with lichen, stairwells polished to a dull glow by generations of cautious feet, and the faint odor of coal smoke that no longer had a source. The porter led us through corridors lined with portraits of men whose eyes seemed to follow in judgment. His keys jingled like coins in a collection plate. The Don, whose name I remembered only vaguely from old lectures, Parry or Perry, lay stretched on a chaise under a tartan rug. His skin had the yellow-grey tone of wax candles left too long in a draught. No overturned chair, no scattered papers, nothing to suggest panic. The room smelt of dust and a faint trace of eau de cologne. On the desk, a half-finished letter rested beneath a paperweight shaped like a rook from a chess set. But it was the wireless that drew my eyes before anything else. It sat on a mahogany stand near the window, volume turned high enough to fill the room with Schubert's Impromptu in G-flat, a performance recorded decades earlier, judging by the soft crackle beneath the notes. Yet its cord lay coiled like a sleeping snake, plug prongs catching the light. Lewis muttered that someone must have been here before us. I said nothing, running a finger along the dial, which was set not to the BBC but to some obscure band between frequencies. The music played on, serene and untroubled by its impossibility. A subtle deduction flickered at the edge of thought. The paperweight, a rook, covering a letter whose salutation began, "My dear Julia." The chess piece felt wrong in a study lined with books on theology rather than strategy. In the margin of the letter, Perry had scribbled a single word, "Nocturne." I looked again at my morning crossword folded in my coat pocket. Second Life of a Scholar. 6 letters. Perhaps return. Perhaps retune. I closed the paper without writing it in. Lewis asked if it could have been suicide. I told him people rarely orchestrate their own deaths to Schubert at full volume with the plug out of the wall. He gave me the glance he reserves for my more cryptic pronouncements, but said nothing further. Outside the window, a bell tolled somewhere in another quad. Its echo entered the room like a reproach. Before leaving, I touched the wireless once more. The music ended with a sigh of static, then silence. The plug remained on the floor, indifferent. In my pocket, the folded crossword felt heavier than it should have been, as if it too had absorbed some of the room's secret. I told Lewis we should speak to the bursar before word spread. He nodded, glancing back at the chaise as though expecting the dawn to stir. On the way out through the cloister, I noticed a small puddle where no rain could have reached, and in it the blurred reflection of the chapel spire bent at an odd angle. The image seemed to flicker, then settle. I walked on without remarking it aloud. Some details are best left to arrange themselves quietly, like notes waiting for the next movement. The rain had softened into a mist by the time we walked back through the front gate of St. Cuthbert's, the ironwork slick beneath my palm. Inside, the college smelled of damp stone and old varnish, like the residue of years that refused to dry. The cloister's arches framed the quadrangle in grey light. Puddles lay on the flagstones like dark panes of glass. Lewis muttered that the place felt too quiet for midterm, and I agreed silently. Oxford's silences can be more eloquent than its lectures. We passed faded photographs of rowing crews hung along the corridor. Rows of lean young men staring out with identical determination, their signatures curling beneath in sepia ink. The faces blurred as I walked, each one seeming to contain the ghost of another. The smell of paper from the senior common room drifted under a door. Someone had been turning pages recently. Julia Marsh was waiting in the bursar's office, a room lined with shelves of accounts bound in cracked leather. She rose as we entered, tall and deliberate, her hair pulled back with an austerity that suggested she had no time for small gestures. She said she had been expecting us. Her voice was low, controlled, almost musical. She spoke of the late Dr. Parry as a valued colleague, but not a friend, adding that the college's finances were secure and his death a private loss. Yet as she slid a ledger back into place, I noticed a faint tremor in her fingers, a detail too slight for Lewis to register. She had a stack of old receipts on her desk. One at the top bore a date that should not have existed, the 30th of February. I tucked the knowledge away. Reverend Collins received us in a chapel side room cluttered with brass candlesticks and an incongruous array of vintage radios. The smell of wax and solder hung in the air. He explained, unasked, that he collected them for their history of carrying unseen voices. He smiled, but the smile faltered as he added that Parry had recently borrowed one for an experiment of some sort. Lewis asked what kind. Collins only said that the Don had been a man who preferred static to silence, then turned to polish a candlestick already gleaming. I saw a note pinned above his desk. Psalm 19, frequency 94.5. It was not a psalm number I recognized. Peter Armitage, the visiting lecturer, met us under a dripping archway near the library. He had the restless eyes of someone perpetually rehearsing excuses. He spoke of debts with a thin laugh, insisting they were under control, and of Parry with a shrug that was meant to seem affectionate. He carried a folder of tutorial notes, but a corner of a betting slip protruded like a careless tongue. When Lewis asked about the night of the death, Armitage said he had been in the city. I asked where. He named a pub that had closed months ago. Mrs. Devine found us before we could find her, emerging from a stairwell with a mop and bucket as if she had been waiting for our passage. She had served the college for decades, she said, and knew the habits of its men better than they knew themselves. Parry had been secretive lately, locking his door at odd hours, speaking softly into the wireless as though someone might answer. She paused then, glancing at the ceiling. Her eyes moved in the direction of Julia Marsh's office before settling back on me. Nothing more. We stood in the cloister once again. The rain had ceased, but the stones still glistened, reflecting the chapel spire in fractured pieces. Lewis remarked on the college's eerie quiet. I thought of my crossword folded in my coat, of the clue about a second life of a scholar, still unanswered. The faces in the rowing photographs stared on, each rower's eyes fixed somewhere beyond us, as though they knew the score before it was played. I found myself thinking that closed quads breed closed lives, and that secrets move through them like faint signals, waiting for someone to tune in. The afternoon light in Parry's rooms had the color of watered sherry, thin and apologetic, falling across the wireless like a confession. Lewis had been going through drawers with the quiet efficiency of someone who distrusts my wandering silences. I had knelt beside the wireless again, this time not to test the dial, but to look at its back. The panel came away with an ease that suggested recent tampering, screws already loosened. Inside, among dust and a dead spider, lay a folded sheet of paper. It was the torn page of a diary, lined but unsigned, the handwriting a mixture of neat capitals and sudden tremors. Across it sprawled half-finished crossword clues. Nocturne. Transmission for the sleepless, 7 letters. Number station, voice without body, 5. A note at the bottom read simply, "Tune but do not speak." The ink had bled in one corner as though touched by damp fingers. I stared at it for a long moment, feeling the question settle rather than sharpen. Lewis asked if I had found anything. I told him it was just a list of clues, though I heard how unconvincing it sounded. He preferred evidence he could label and bag. He had been photographing the study with a small camera, each flash briefly bleaching the room into starkness. He spoke of fingerprints, footprints, of timetables. I let his words drift like static. On the mantel stood a small book of Thomas Hardy's poems, dog-eared at During Wind and Rain. Collins had quoted from it in his sermon that morning, or rather misquoted, altering a line about pale hands to still hands. It had caught my ear at the time, but slipped away until now. I lifted the book, its spine cracked, and reread the stanza. Pale hands, not still. A small change, but deliberate. Collins had been speaking about unseen messages, about faith transmitted across centuries. His face had been serene, but his fingers restless on the pulpit edge. The diary page trembled slightly between my thumb and forefinger. Nocturne, number station. The first letters of each clue, N and N, a stuttering of intent. I thought of the crossword still folded in my coat. Station of remorse, 4 letters. Gate, I had guessed. Or maybe etap, the reverse of pâté. My mind circled it like a moth around a lamp. Lewis called my name. He had found a set of keys in the desk drawer, each tagged except one blank brass piece. He asked if it meant anything. I said perhaps it opened something that no longer existed. He frowned at me as though I were the suspect. Outside, the chapel bell began its hour, each chime dull and patient, echoing through the stone like footsteps behind a door. I slid the diary page back into the wireless, but left it half visible. The set remained silent, its dial still fixed between stations, needle trembling slightly, though no current ran. I wondered who had hidden the page there, whether it was meant to be found or meant to be forgotten. Messages are not always sent to be received. Some are left as anchors to memory. Lewis wanted to know if we were finished for the day. He had that look of a man thinking about supper rather than subterfuge. I told him we were done for now. As we stepped into the corridor, the smell of paper and polish rose from the library below, a scent both clean and mournful. I heard Collins's misquoted line again in my head, still hands instead of pale. A minor slip, unless it was a code. Perhaps the chaplain collected more than radios. The cloister outside held its mist like a breath. Lewis walked ahead, keys rattling softly. I stayed back a moment, reading the damp stone under my feet, the way water pooled where no rain had fallen, as if the building itself leaked memory. The diary page's words clung to me like static, faint but insistent. Tune, but do not speak. The coroner's note reached me just after dawn, slipped under my door like an accusation. The handwriting was brisk, almost jaunty, but the words were not. Traces of digitalis found in Parry's blood. Not enough to shout murder, but enough to hush a heart. I read it twice while the kettle stuttered on the hob. Outside, mist had dulled the city into shapes of charcoal and ash. My pencil lay across the crossword as if abandoned mid-thought. The clue waiting for me was imitation of a signal. 5 letters. I had written echo and then rubbed it out. At St. Cuthbert's the air felt heavier, as though the cloisters had drawn in the breath of scandal and were holding it. Lewis met me in the porter's lodge with a sheaf of statements from the kitchen staff. Nothing unusual in the herbs, they insisted. No foxglove creeping into sauces. I walked through the narrow passage to the kitchens myself. The smell of boiled cabbage and bleach hovered in the tiled room. A young cook stood at the sink polishing a ladle with needless force. She told me Parry had eaten sparingly at the fellows' dinner, only sipped the wine. Her hands were raw from scrubbing. I noticed a faint trace of green on the windowsill. Not herb, just mold. The wine bottle itself sat on a steel counter like a relic. Lewis had already sent its contents to the lab. The report was back. Clean. I held it to the light anyway, turning it slowly. The glass was green, the sort favored by vineyards that want to disguise the age of their product. The cork bore a smudge of something darker than wine, but it might have been nothing more than wax. Another red herring to place on my internal board of disappointments. Julia Marsh's alibi arrived before she did, typed on headed paper, minutes of a committee meeting held in another quad at precisely the time of Parry's death. When she finally entered the bursar's office, she moved with that same deliberate grace, as though each step had been proofread. She spoke of budgets and maintenance schedules, of new scholarships, her tone cool enough to frost glass. Lewis asked her directly about the dinner. She replied she had left early, committee obligations. I said nothing, only watched her push a strand of hair behind her ear with the back of her hand, a movement too controlled to be casual. In her briefcase, a slip of blue paper showed between files, a music program from a concert that had never been advertised. Back in Parry's rooms, I unfolded the diary fragment again. Nocturne, number station, tune but do not speak. I traced each letter with my finger. The rhythm was off. Crosswords are like music, depend on cadence. Whoever wrote this had tried to mimic another's style and missed the tempo. A false echo. The clue about imitation still hovered in my head. 5 letters. Not echo, not mimic. The answer flickered, but would not stay. Lewis talked on about chain of custody, about kitchen deliveries and sealed crates. I heard his words as one hears a distant station fading in and out. The wireless sat mute on its stand. In the silence, I noticed a small discrepancy. The diary page folded twice, lengthwise, then once across. The way a bank slip is folded to fit a wallet. Not the way Parry folded his papers, which I had seen stacked neatly in the desk. Someone else's hand had done this. We left the room and stepped into the corridor. Floorboards creaked under the worn carpet. The college bell tolled somewhere beyond the quad, its note caught in the mist like a thread of metal. Lewis muttered that the kitchen staff were lying, or the coroner was wrong. I told him sometimes the first sound you hear isn't the true signal but the echo that arrives later. He gave me a sideways glance, as if to ask whether I was talking about the case or myself. Back at my flat that night, I spread the diary page beside the crossword. The clue about imitation glared up at me. The answer still refused to surface. I poured a measure of whiskey and stared at the paper until the letters blurred, wondering whose voice had been transmitted through that wireless and whether I had already heard it without recognizing the tune. The college after midnight is another country. The rain had stopped hours before, but left a sheen on the flagstones that caught the moonlight in scattered shards. I walked without destination through the cloisters, coat collar turned up, my footsteps muffled by the ancient stone. The air smelled of extinguished candles and old paper, as though the building itself had been reading and then shut the book. Somewhere, a clock struck 12 in a tone more sigh than chime. It was then I heard it, a thin thread of static seeping from an empty corridor, not loud enough to be real, yet too insistent to dismiss. I followed it past the chapel door, its wood dark with centuries of hands, until I reached a small antechamber lined with unused hymnals. The sound stopped as soon as I stepped inside. Only the faint tick of a radiator remained. I put my hand on the wall where the noise had been. The plaster felt cool and slightly damp, as though the stone had been listening. Standing there, I thought of my father's radio. A wooden cabinet with a dial that glowed like a tiny sun. He would sit beside it evenings, listening to broadcasts from stations whose names sounded like faraway kingdoms. Once, late at night, a woman's voice came through reading a poem in a language neither of us knew. He told me some voices travel farther than their owners ever intended. That memory led, without my permission, to another, the girl with the cello. She had invited me to a recital in a church off the Banbury Road. I had been late, lost in a crossword in a pub, and arrived only for the applause. She smiled when she saw me, but never called again. Even now, decades later, I can summon her expression more easily than her name. I left the antechamber and climbed the worn stairs to the senior common room. Its door yielded reluctantly, hinges whispering like disapproval. The room was lit only by a reading lamp left on beside a leather armchair, casting an amber pool onto the carpet. The smell here was of port and polish, with an undertone of cold ash from the fireplace. Bookshelves lined the walls, and above them hung photographs of tutorial groups, each framed in dark wood. I moved along the row of images, eyes adjusting to the dimness. 1976. A cluster of young faces, one or two now eminent, one or two dead. 1977. The same. 1978. A photograph labeled Complete Cohort. 8 students, the tutor in the center, smiling formally. Except it was not complete. Parry's name appeared on the caption, but his face was absent, replaced by a blank space where someone had cut or covered it long ago. The frame's glass showed a faint outline, as if a figure had been peeled away. Lewis would have called it an archival oversight. I knew better. Academic life thrives on records. Absences are deliberate. My fingers brushed the caption, feeling the slight ridge of dried glue. Beneath the lamp, the dust motes turned like slow snow. I remembered the diary fragment in my coat pocket, its references to nocturnes and numbers. Parry had been tuned to something private even then. I sat for a moment in the armchair listening. The building creaked as it cooled, floorboards shifting like old men in sleep. From somewhere below came the low hiss of pipes, or perhaps another pulse of static. It reminded me of breath caught at the edge of a confession. My pencil lay in my pocket with the crossword from the morning. I took it out, but did not write anything, only stared at the unfinished clue about imitation. 5 letters. Still no answer. When I rose, the photograph's blank space seemed to watch me. I turned off the lamp, leaving the room to its shadows. As I stepped back into the corridor, the faint static returned for an instant, then faded, as though a signal had been sent and received. I walked on through the sleeping college, the stone echoing each step a fraction after it fell, like a voice repeating itself across time. The day had that washed-out light Oxford sometimes wears after rain, pale enough to make the college stone look like old bone. Lewis had taken Armitage into a side room off the senior common room for questioning, leaving the door ajar so that I could hear without appearing to listen. The smell of beeswax and damp wool drifted in, along with the occasional scrape of a chair. I leaned against the paneled wall, pencil poised above a crossword I was no longer solving. The clue before me read, Voice Without Truth. 7 letters. Inside, Armitage's voice moved between charm and weariness, a performance rehearsed too many times. He spoke of debts acquired in a moment of rashness, of a benefactor whose generosity had turned to blackmail. He said he had been paying quietly, sacrificing his own reputation to protect someone else. It was an appealing narrative, a martyrdom by installments. But even as he spoke, I caught the misstep. He quoted a line from Auden about truth being one and indivisible, except the line was not Auden's and never had been. The slip passed over Lewis like static. To me, it rang like a bell behind a closed door. I kept my silence. Misquoted poets can reveal more than miscounted money. Instead, I studied Armitage's hands. One thumb rubbed the edge of a folded betting slip in his pocket. His eyes flicked not at Lewis, but at the corridor beyond, where he must have known I was standing. When Lewis pressed him on his whereabouts during Parry's death, Armitage gave the same alibi he had before, naming a pub now shuttered, adding a flourish about seeing a football match on the television there. His tone suggested this small domestic detail should secure belief. Later, in the chaplain's quarters, Collins welcomed us with an air of strained affability. The room smelled of warm dust and candle smoke. His collection of vintage radios lined the shelves like a congregation of mute witnesses. Their dials caught the light, small suns arranged in rows. One in particular, a battered model with a crack across its grille, was the twin of the set from Parry's study, even to the faint scorch mark near the plug. Collins said they were merely curiosities, rescued from jumble sales, restored in the evenings when the chapel stood empty. He smiled at his own industry, but his fingers fussed with a tuning knob that refused to turn. Lewis asked about rumors he had heard among the porters, secret Masonic codes embedded in old college broadcasts, clandestine transmissions between dons on forbidden frequencies. Collins laughed, not a nervous laugh, but the kind of laugh meant to deflect. He spoke of myth, of students feeding ghost stories to freshers, of a long-gone prank where the chapel bell tolled in prime numbers at dawn. All very amusing, he said, and wholly untrue. I let him speak, watching the way his eyes lingered on the identical wireless as though it might contradict him. We left with nothing more than stories. In the cloister, the air felt thinner, as if the stone had been holding its breath during our visit. Lewis muttered that Armitage's tale of blackmail was either real or the best rehearsal he'd ever heard. I said perhaps it was both. My crossword remained folded in my pocket. Voice without truth, 7 letters. The answer flickered at the edge of thought, but stayed hidden. We passed under the photograph of the 1978 tutorial group again. The blank space where Parry's face should have been seemed larger in the afternoon light, as though absence itself had grown. Collins's radios, Armitage's debts, Julia's alibi, all signals, no certainty. I found myself listening for static that was not there, a silence heavier than sound. Night had not yet fallen, but the college already wore its evening hush, the kind that creeps along corridors before Compline. I'd arranged to meet Mrs. Devine in the small cloakroom behind the kitchens, a space that smelled of damp coats and the faint sweetness of old polish. She stood by the window with her hands folded into the apron she always wore, eyes fixed on the quadrangle beyond. When she spoke, her voice came low and deliberate, like someone reading a passage meant only for herself. She said she had once walked in on Dr. Parry and Julia Marsh, not long before his death. They had been arguing over a will. Whose, she could not say. And Julia had been holding a pen above a document as though about to sign. Parry's face had been the color of paper. She had backed out quietly, but the sound of their voices had stayed with her like an aftertaste. I asked if she had told anyone. She said no, because quarrels between dons were like weather, best endured, not reported. Her eyes flicked to mine for a second, then away again, as if she had already regretted telling me. I thanked her and left her in the cloakroom with the smell of damp wool and memories. Collins received me later in the chapel vestry. The room was lit only by the pale squares of the stained glass windows, and a single lamp whose shade cast a narrow circle on the desk. His radios were stacked in a corner, their dials unlit but suggestive of sleeping eyes. I mentioned number stations as casually as I could, as if the phrase had arrived in conversation by chance. He stiffened almost imperceptibly, the way a man might when a long-forgotten name is spoken aloud. He asked what I meant. I said Parry had taken an interest in obscure transmissions, nocturnes of the ether. Collins's hand hovered above a tuning knob, then dropped. He denied knowing anything, his voice smooth but slightly too quick. In that denial there was a tremor, not enough for proof, but enough to make me step closer to the radios. One bore a scrap of paper taped to its side. Psalm 19 again, the frequency scrawled beneath. I ran my finger across it. Collins moved the lamp so its light fell away from the scrap. An oddly defensive gesture. I let it pass. The college archive lay under the library, a vaulted space where the smell of paper deepens into something almost mineral. I had come there on a hunch, following not evidence but the faint pull of a pattern. The archivist unlocked a drawer for me, more out of boredom than courtesy, and left me with boxes of thin folders. It was in one of these, labeled Miscellaneous Correspondence, that I found the second diary page. Same handwriting as the first, but more hurried, as though the words were trying to outrun the pen. Broadcasting remorse across closed fields. Do not repeat. a small drawing in the margin, a circle with 3 short lines radiating outward like a muted sun. I read it twice, 3 times. The rhythm again was off, but differently this time, a syncopation rather than a stumble. Broadcasting remorse. The phrase sat in my mind like an unclaimed suitcase. I slipped the page into my coat pocket and rose, brushing dust from my hands. On the way out of the archive, my footsteps echoed against the stone in a pattern that made me pause. 3 beats, then a pause, then 3 again. Morse code for S. I told myself it was coincidence, but found I was walking in time to it. Outside, the rain had started once more, fine as static. Back in my rooms later, I spread both diary pages on the table beside the crossword, still unfinished. The clue I had been avoiding now read simply, "Regret on air." 7 letters. My pencil hovered, but did not touch the paper. There are signals one can sense, but not yet decode. The air fills with them, and you wait, patient or not, for meaning to emerge. The night had drawn itself tight around my flat like an old curtain. Rain whispered on the sash window, and the room smelt of cold stone and whiskey left too long in its glass. I sat at the table with both diary pages spread before me, their creases softening under the lamp. The wireless on the sideboard emitted a faint opera broadcast, a mezzo voice rising through static, part aria, part ghost. It reminded me of evenings at my father's set, that sense of something traveling immense distances only to arrive thin and frayed. I traced the ink of the first diary page with a fingertip. Nocturne. Transmission for the sleepless. Numbers, station. Voice without body. Tune, but do not speak. The handwriting tilted, then straightened, like a man trying to walk a line after drink. I had read these clues so many times they had blurred into shape rather than meaning. But that night, under the scratch of rain and opera, a small alignment occurred. I began to copy the first letters of each clue down the margin, absent-minded at first, the way one doodles during a tedious meeting. N for nocturne, N for numbers, T for tune, B for broadcast, the letters stacked without sense. I moved to the second page. Broadcasting remorse across closed fields. Do not repeat. The same impulse. First letters, side by side. And then it came, hesitant but undeniable. J-U-L. 5 letters rising from the paper like something hidden under dust. I sat back and listened to the radio. The mezzo had reached a high note that wavered, then held, as though aware of its own fragility. Julia. The name had been in the case from the start, but only as one, more civilized mask among others. Now it surfaced as an acrostic, not as a signature, but as a ghost signal embedded in crossword clues. I thought of her measured voice, her deliberate gestures, the committee minutes she had so promptly provided. The first time we met, she had said the college's finances were secure. She had not said her own. On the sideboard, the wireless flickered. The dial's thin needle pointed to 9405, though I had not set it. A small detail, but telling. 9:45, the time of the fellow's dinner on the night Parry died. I recalled the wireless in his room, its plug coiled neatly on the floor, its dial fixed between stations. Between stations, but precisely at 9:45. Not random, chosen. Lewis's voice from earlier in the day drifted back to me. He had been talking about timestamps on delivery logs, his tone weary with the weight of minutiae. I had half listened, thinking of other things. Now his words glinted like pins on a map. Deliveries, schedules, frequencies. Julia in another quad at precisely the right time, a perfect alibi, or a perfectly tuned one. I poured a measure of whiskey but did not drink. The opera swelled, then dissolved into static as the signal shifted. I stared at the diary pages until the ink seemed to ripple. J-O-I-L. I letters hiding in plain sight. My pencil hovered over the crossword still open beside me. Voice without truth, 7 letters. I wrote in listener, then rubbed it out. Wrote sipai, rubbed that out too. Outside, a car passed, throwing a brief fan of light across the room. The wireless needle trembled, but held at 9:45. I thought again of Parry's hands folded under the tartan rug, of Julia's fingers steady on the ledger except for one small tremor, of Carling's face when I spoke of number stations, all fragments, each with its own frequency. I closed my eyes and let the opera's last note fade into silence. In the hush, I could almost hear a second signal beneath the first, like an echo arriving late across water. Some truths require listening twice, once with the ear, once with whatever remains. I opened my eyes to the diary pages and felt the pattern click, not as revelation, but as a chord struck in a dark room, resonant yet unresolved. I asked Julia to meet me in the old reading room at dusk. It was the one place in St. Cuthbert's where the lamps were still gaslit, their light wavering like thoughts half-formed. Rain had returned in fine threads against the mullioned windows. The smell of wet ivy crept in through a crack in the sill. She arrived without coat or umbrella, a single folder under her arm, her face as composed as the spines of the ledgers behind her. I spoke first, not in accusation, but in recollection. I told her about the diary pages hidden in Parry's wireless, about the acrostic of her name spelled out in crossword clues, about the tuning dial fixed at 9:45, the moment when the fellow's dinner began. She listened without interruption, standing at the far end of the table where a pool of lamplight touched her fingers. Only once did she move, a small shift of weight when I mentioned the herb garden behind the kitchens. She asked how long I had known. I said perhaps from the beginning, though in truth the pattern had only clicked the night before. She said Parry had been a man who loved riddles, who needed puzzles to feel alive. She had fed him the coded messages, she said, to keep him guessing, and later to misdirect me, knowing my own fondness for hidden structures. Her voice was low, steady, but the words thinned as they left her. I told her the coroner's note about digitalis, the absence of foxglove in the kitchen but not in the garden. She said the garden belonged to no one and everyone, that its plants had been there for centuries. The folder she carried slipped slightly in her grasp. A program from a concert protruded from it, the same concert whose date had never been advertised. She said she had loved Parry once, or thought she had, until he altered the will that had promised her security. Her tone held neither plea nor pride, only fatigue. As she spoke, my eye caught a small deduction at the edge of things, the lamplight glinting off the brass clasp of her folder. It bore the crest of another college, not St. Cuthbert's, a committee badge from the night of her alibi. She had carried it as though by reflex, a token of the fiction she had built. I could have pressed her then, turned the quiet room into an interrogation chamber, but instead I let the silence lengthen. Outside, the rain beat softly on the glass like fingertips on a radio dial. She asked if Lewis would be the one to come for her. I said yes. She nodded once, as though relieved. Lewis arrived a few minutes later, bringing with him the smell of wet wool and the briskness of procedure. I stepped back while he read the formal caution, my hands behind my back. Julia's face remained poised, but a tremor flickered across her mouth at the word arrest. She closed her folder carefully, aligning its edges as if tidying a desk. While Lewis guided her out, I stayed by the window. The gas lamp hissed softly, its flame shivering in the draught. From somewhere in the quad, a faint thread of static rose. Perhaps the chaplain's radio, perhaps only the pipes. I thought of my father's set, of the girl with the cello, of all the signals that travel too far and arrive too late. When the door closed behind them, the room seemed to inhale. I reached into my coat and unfolded the diary pages once more, broadcasting remorse across closed fields. Do not repeat. The opera on my wireless at home would be ending about now, its last note fading into silence. Some transmissions end cleanly, others linger like after-images. I left the reading room without switching off the gas lamp, letting its hiss and light stand in for whatever words I had not spoken. The Jericho Tavern had not changed, at least not in the ways that mattered. The same scuffed floorboards, the same faint smell of beer soaked into the timber like a memory too stubborn to leave. Only the weather was different. Rain streaked the leaded windows in erratic trails, more hesitant than the sheets of November, but enough to dim the light inside to an amber hush. I had taken my old corner seat. Before me stood the transistor radio from those first days of the case, its grill still cracked, its cord still coiled on the floor like a snake hibernating. This time it offered no music. Lewis sat opposite, coat unbuttoned, his notebook open beside an untouched half-pint. He was talking about paperwork, the inevitable procession of statements, evidence bags, and signatures that would march across his desk for weeks. His voice had a comfortable rhythm, a metronome against the silence of the radio. I let him speak without listening, the way one lets a tide lap at one's ankles. I watched the rain trace its lines on the glass and found my thoughts drifting not to the case in its entirety, but to Julia's face at the moment the pattern had clicked. She had not looked shocked so much as quietly resigned, as though she had been waiting for the chord to sound and knew it would. There was no triumph in her eyes, no plea either. Only the recognition that a signal sent in secret can be intercepted, and that once decoded, belongs to the listener. The unplugged radio beside me reflected her expression in miniature. During the investigation, it had been a curiosity, a metaphor if one wanted one. Now it sat inert, speaker dark, as though it too had been found out. I wondered if it had ever truly played, or if I had been listening to something else entirely. My own expectation, the echo of Schubert in memory rather than air. Lewis was asking if I would testify about the diary pages, about the herb garden. I said perhaps. He said the Crown would want me. I told him the Crown seldom wants anyone, it only requires. He laughed softly, then returned to his notes. A strand of lamplight fell across his wristwatch, and the time read 9:45. I felt a brief chill at the coincidence. My crossword lay folded in my pocket. Voice without truth. 7 letters. Still blank. I took it out and stared at the grid, but did not lift the pencil. The pub's low murmur of conversation ebbed and flowed. Somewhere behind the bar, a glass clinked like a small bell. I thought of Julia again, of her fingers steady on the folder even as Lewis read the caution, of the way she aligned the papers before leaving. Love, betrayal, desperation, neat columns she had tried to balance and failed. I wondered if she had known the diary pages would reach me, or if she had left them as one leaves crumbs for a bird that never comes. The radio remained mute. I leaned closer and placed my hand on its casing. Cold plastic, a faint smell of dust. Nothing stirred. Rain pressed harder against the window, and for a moment the sound of it grew into a rhythm like distant applause. Lewis closed his notebook. He asked if I was all right. I said I was listening. He looked at the radio and said it wasn't playing. I said perhaps it never had. He shrugged, stood, and went to settle the bill. Alone in the snug, I watched the rain blur the street lamps outside until they became soft circles. The unplugged radio sat between my hands like a sealed envelope. No aria rose from it, no static, no hidden code. Only silence, patient and complete. I thought of my father's set, of the cello girl's recital I had missed, of Julia's eyes when she realized she had been heard. Some transmissions end in words, others dissolve into the air before reaching anyone at all. Grey had settled over Oxford like a low ceiling, compressing sound and light until both felt hesitant. The cobbles of St. Cuthbert's glistened from a drizzle that was neither rain nor mist, but a thin exhalation of the stone itself. I walked alone through the quadrangle, its echo stripped of students now that the investigation had concluded, and the term's end crept closer. The chapel bell began its hour, each toll slow enough to stand between, a reminder that time is measured by pauses as much as by strikes. Lewis had left earlier with a bundle of files tucked under his arm, a muttered comment about court schedules and depositions trailing behind him like a half-remembered refrain. I had declined his offer of a lift. Some walks need to be taken in silence, and this was one. The college smelled of extinguished fires, of damp wool, of paper whose ink had just begun to fade. In the bursar's window, a single lamp still burned. It cast a pale triangle across the rain-darkened glass, but revealed no movement inside. I passed the chapel steps. Collins's radios had been removed from his vestry, lined up in storage like unspeaking choir boys. The absence of their dials glinting in the half-light felt almost louder than their presence had. For a moment I imagined hearing static from the empty room, a thread of sound rising then sinking into nothing. But when I paused, the air was empty, only the smell of cold stone and candle wax remaining. My crossword, folded in my coat pocket, still bore its blank square. Voice without truth, 7 letters. I had stopped trying to fill it. Some answers refused the grid. I fingered the paper absently as I walked, thinking of Julia aligning her folder before leaving with Lewis, of her face as she realized the pattern had been heard. There had been no confession in words, only an arrangement. At the gate, I turned once more to look at the quadrangle. Rain drew soft lines down the archway. The bell gave its last toll and left a hush behind. Into that hush drifted a fragment of Schubert from somewhere beyond the walls. A car passing on the street, window cracked, radio tuned to a station I could not name. A mere bar of melody, high and dissolving, like breath in cold air. I stopped. The sound thinned, trembled, and vanished into the grey. I could not tell if it was real or only memory rising from the case's residue, a ghost of the opening night at the Jericho Tavern, the unplugged set leaking its impossible music. The drizzle thickened just enough to blur the spire across the road. I closed my eyes, letting the fragment echo once more inside my head, unanchored to any source. Some signals, I thought, are never received at all. They drift outward until they fade, carrying only the proof of having been sent. And some, though ended, linger in the ear like a faint note long after the transmission stops.